Welcome back to part 3. We'll be talking to Harald in this part about his time at Luke Air Force Base and also a little incident that happened with Hans. But now the serious business starts. Harald's got his wings, he's passed out, he's now a fighter pilot ready to train on the F-104 Starfighter. So Harry, you've had your bit of R&R, you've had 6 weeks off for however long it was to go round and see Niagara Falls and other bits and pieces of the country. The Cadillac served you well.
It
and you're now back on the ground,
yes,
and ready to do the next part of your
yes,
career training in fighter pilot on the Starfighter. Yeah. Well, what was it like your first few days?
I have to say, which is interesting, the gallon of fuel, a gallon, which is about 4 liters, cost 18 cents. 18 cents of a dollar.
Yes. Funny how you can remember your first one, isn't it?
I remember that, especially now that the gallon costs, I don't know, $3 or $4 already. Okay, that is 60 years ago. In Luke Air Force Base, of course, we arrived there as pilots. We had our wings. We had all about 260 hours of flying a jet aircraft. And now we were about to learn to fly the aircraft and use it as a weapon. This is what Luke Air Force Base is. Aside from Williams Air Force Base, Luke Air Force Base is a base where you are trained as a fighter pilot.
In the form of combat?
Yes.
So you actually have a firing range there?
Fly the aircraft and use it as a weapon in combat, yes. It consists of flying it as a air support with bombs and rockets, and flying it in air combat training. That means fight up there against other aircraft up in the air. There's 2 different paths that the training consists of. The first part was of course the close air support. That means consisted of dive bombing, air-to-ground rocketing with rockets to shoot and target on the ground, strafing to shoot the Gatling gun, you know, this rotating gun, which makes theoretically 6,000 rounds per minute. So it's a very, very fast gun. Of course, initially you learn how to fly this aircraft. Before you can use it as a weapon, you have to know how to fly it. There was day and night flights with this aircraft, and the training consists of flying in a double-seater. There is an 104 that has a back seat, just like that.
Which is the training version.
That's the training version. You have to learn how to fly it first with a trainer behind you to show you how to do it. And then, of course, there's a single aircraft that has weapon stations under the wings and under the belly, and that is being flown by the pilot himself without an instructor. The instructor would be in his own single aircraft. One of this...
And he would be flying on the wing, would he?
He either flies on the wing or you fly on his wing initially. You know, when you go onto a bombing range, this Luke Air Force Base had a range in the so-called White Tank Mountains. You go usually as a 4-ship, that means with 4 aircraft. There is 1 instructor and 3 student pilots. And but every single weapon run, like a bomb run or a strafing run, is done by an individual pilot. That means up there over the range, the flight of 4 splits up into 4 a single aircraft with a distance on the time and the distance in between. You cannot bomb with all 4 aircraft at once. And you also do night flying and night bombing. And yeah, on one of these night flights, solo flights, of course, something happened to Hans up there in the air.
But before we just talk about Hans for a moment, you still have to go through the preliminary class work and
yes, of course,
and the preliminary training of the 104
yes,
before you become competent enough to go solo.
Yes.
So you've got to pass out at that level, haven't you?
Well, of course, you start up in the dual-seater. They teach you how to fly a traffic pattern, how to land, how to navigate the aircraft. But that's it. I mean, you are a pilot.
Because
you don't have 130 hours to fly.
For sure, yeah. I mean, you're expected to be able to be relatively competent.
Of course.
And pick things up
yes,
relatively quickly.
Solo was after 5-6 hours.
Right.
You flew it solo, and from that time on, of course, you flew in the double seater to be trained on the bombing range, you know, to learn how to do this. But later on, the last part of the training was only in a single aircraft, and not in the double seater anymore. And the instructor was also in his own 104. It is very expensive and extensive training. Remember one thing, on the 104, every pilot had his own instructor. It was not like in the Air Training Command, where one instructor had 2 or 3 students. He had every single pilot had his own instructor and nobody else. And who was responsible for the training and make sure to develop out of the student pilot a fighter pilot for a squadron later on. And this is how the training in the United States Air Force works. We did this on the 104, and of course the rest did it on the aircraft that they picked to fly later on.
So now, okay, so you're now competent and you're doing night flights.
Yes.
Night training flights, reconnaissance flights.
It was a night solo flight, just to get used how the aircraft looks like. There's nothing you can see outside. You have your instruments. It is dark.
So
it's different. There's no horizon. Usually no horizon that you see. You have to rely only on the instruments.
And you're sitting on the ground.
On this particular day, the way this runs on this basis, there's a so-called a ground tower. It's not a tower. It's a self-propelled little tower that with 4 wheels that sits at the end of the runway. It's called the mobile unit. It says by itself. It says mobile. Now, when there are students out there training and flying, there is an instructor and a student sitting in the mobile unit, and the instructor is overseeing the landings, the touch and goes and others. That is the same thing on a night flight. You have that mobile unit because people are going out and coming back, flying touch and goes, and finally land. So on this particular night, I was sitting there with Nobby Walsh for the, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Lieutenant Colonel, and we were not talking about flying. We were talking about how nice life is as a fighter pilot. How nice American cars are, and we are putting honey about each other's mouth. Nobody was thinking anything bad. until Hans, who had just been taken off and was on the climb out, started screaming on the radio, because this mobile unit has a radio and there's contact with the pilots that are up there in the area. And it was not very clear what he was, but it sounded like he was in very deep trouble. So Nobel finally said, when he couldn't get any proper answer, finally said, bail out. The aircraft you can spare. The pilot is, if the pilot is gone, he's gone, right? So we told him to bail out. We didn't hear anything anymore, and it was not very long. The search and rescue team went out there into the desert trying to find that place. Now, the aircraft had crashed. They didn't have any problems. Later on we heard about this here, because there was in the desert, there was a place that was burning and flaming, so that's where the aircraft was. But that's not where Hans, where Hans was. They finally went down there and found the rubbish of the aircraft, and they circled it, concentric circles, to find the pilot, because the pilot was not there. And they finally found his chute, but Hans was not in the chute. So it looked to them like he must have landed with the chute. The chute was sitting in the cactus, in one of the Savaro cacti, typical cacti there in Arizona.
Of all the places to land.
A hell of a place, because it has stinks, and 5 inches long stinks, besides the fact that it is quite big and tall. It's a cactus that only stays there and lives there in this area. You cannot find it anywhere else on Earth. We finally found him, and as it looked like, and he said later on he was panicking when he landed there, and unstrapped out of his parachute and kept running into the dark. There is no light, no nothing, it was dark there. Until he couldn't run anymore, he ran out of power, and then that's where they found him. And we were sitting there in our BOQ, all Germans collected, because we knew what happened for me. I was in the mobile unit, and we thought, my goodness, another one. We had the radio on, and around midnight there was an announcement. They said a 104 had been crashing, and they gave the area where it had been crashed. And now it comes, it said, and the pilot, Hans Schmidt, escaped serious injury.
Wow.
That time we knew he was alive and he had escaped serious injury. A couple of hours later, we were still there drinking whiskey and talking about flying. Knock, knock at the door, and he came in. After the initial briefing and interrogating that they did with him, they released him into the barracks. And a week later, he was flying again. And of course, he finished the program and went with me back to Germany later on.
You both travelled back to Germany together, when the program was
we travelled back together.
How long did the program last?
The program lasted almost 1 year on the 104. Remember, there's always 2-3 months academics. When you're not flying, you're learning the techniques of the aircraft, and you have physics and all these things that belong to academics. And that always is there before you start flying, of course. You have to have a certain knowledge. Now later on, not at our time, of course, you went into the simulator. But at that time, they didn't have simulators. It was all done in the aircraft. Nowadays, most of the time is done in the simulator. Like on the Airbus 380 that I did my final license on, I never flew the aircraft except in the simulator.
Yes,
it's called zero flight time training.
Yeah.
And
it's quite amazing, isn't it?
You do the training, and later on, the next day, like they do, the next day, you go into the aircraft with your crew and fly.
And take it off,
Yeah. At that time, that was 40, 50 years earlier, we didn't have that. It had to be done on the aircraft.
What do you have any particular memories, fond
yes,
memories?
One memory was because I still did my judo there throughout the whole training. I did judo, and of course we had a dojo in Luke Air Force Base, a big gym with everything in and on it. I had my own trainer, Master Sergeant Martindale, who trained me, who massaged me and prepared me for the Armed Forces Judo Association Championships. That was in Tucson. Tucson is about, and it happened to be in Tucson, it's about 100 kilometers south of Phoenix. If you drive to the Mexican border, to Nogales, it is halfway in between. Quite a big city, and the championships were there. I made it to number 2.
Wow! Yeah.
I didn't make it to number 1 because on the final fight, I broke my toe, and we had to stop the fight. So I was number 2. That was towards the end of the training in the States. Yeah.
So you weren't flying for a little while you're
for a couple of weeks because they put my. It was the left little toe. It was rectangular away from my foot. They put it back, and then they put the whole thing into a cast. And with a cast, you cannot fly. You know. But I had already done all my training, had passed all the checks. So for me, it was not a big problem. That way, it ended almost 3 years training in the United States. And we came back, flew back to Germany.
And on the time when you flew back, because we're coming to the end of part 3 now on episode 1, when you flew back after a 3-year trip aboard, qualified now, fighter pilot, qualified,
wearing proudly the 2 wings.
With it,
yes,
did you wear that uniform back?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, and you would have flown back on the Lufthansa 707.
We flew on the 707 back from not from Phoenix, from New York again. We flew with American Airlines to New York, and then from there with the 707 we flew New York Cologne.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where our thing ended. There was a few days we had off, and then we all were supposed to report to Jever Air Force Base in northern Germany, and Lower Saxony, and we received another 30-40 hours, the so-called European training.
And this
with the
is
European
something
weather.
quite different. Yeah.
That is absolutely different.
So that now brings us to the end of episode 1, part 3, and that also brings us to the time when Harald returned back to Germany and started flying under NATO and the German Luftwaffe Command Air Force to fly under covert conditions during the Cold War. And we will be talking to him about the whole of that period in episode 2. So don't forget to join us in episode 2. Don't forget also to, if you don't mind, is to ring the bell, give us a comment, click like, and most important, subscribe. Thank you very much. sort of do our things.
But remember, you are the boss.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
ask the questions, you lead the way.